Diane? It's October 21st, 2019. The time, 5:16 p.m. While I am aware that it is a Monday and viewers and listeners of Ignore the Bell were expecting my podcast to be released at 4 o'clock, I hope that they can forgive me because I'm trying to do this on my own. This is the first in a lecture series without actually making it a discussion, and I'm doing my best. I've just arrived in the town of Twin Peaks. It's beautiful here. Where do they get those trees? I've stopped at the Double R Diner after being a little worse for the wear from the ride, and I'm going to try the coffee. Diane, this town has got its charms. While I have been on a low carbohydrate diet for a while, I have to admit, I don't think it counts if I'm recording a podcast. I've got these wonderful pastries. It's too bad that a murder has brought me to this town, but I have to admit, it does have its comforts. Hello, and welcome to Ignore the Bell. My name is Nathan. This is a lecture version of the podcast. And what that means is, instead of having a discussion, it's just going to be me doing this. This is titled How to Fall in Love with Twin Peaks. And I've basically got a principle behind this. And namely, Twin Peaks is such an amazing show for people who love it. But for people who don't know the show or who try to watch it without really understanding what it is, I think the show loses people pretty quickly. And so then you get this small group of people who absolutely love the show and who get what it's doing, and then you have a whole bunch of people who just don't know it or have tried it and very quickly decide that it's not for them. What I'm trying to do with this podcast is I'm trying to show exactly what it is that the show is doing, specifically David Lynch and Mark Frost. And so I'm hoping that what this can serve as is for anybody who loves the show, who's got a friend or a family member and you just wish that they could watch it too, but you don't quite know how to explain it to them. Hopefully that's what this podcast can do. So I hope that you enjoy. I'm going to try to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. This really is for people who do love who do love the show Twin Peaks, to be able to see what it is that I'm noticing in the show, and you can certainly comment below in what you're noticing in the show. And then it also can serve as a good introduction to the series. And so this is really going to focus on seasons 1 and 2. I have not watched Twin Peaks The Return or Twin Peaks season 3. I have not actually watched that yet. There's going to be a separate podcast on that, and there very likely will be another podcast on Twin Peaks as an overall discussion, if I can find somebody to actually discuss this with, because if you're looking for Tyler on the podcast, then part of it is that he has not watched Twin Peaks. And so if he is watching or listening to this, then hopefully this can encourage him to show him what it is that I'm seeing in the show and that other people are seeing in the show. But I just couldn't wait anymore. I want to talk about this, so I'm going to do a podcast on this. All right, folks. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoy.
Oh man, I wish this
Lecture
could go on forever.
Ignore the bell! We're gonna keep going, people! Alright, so I have set my timer for 30 minutes. This is the first time that I'm doing the podcast on my own. I already do booktube videos on my own. If you have noticed a difference in quality between the introduction and this, or if I look a little bit different, I recorded that introduction 3 weeks ago or something like that, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and then I did the full podcast twice, and both times my computer just refused to record, or there were glitches in it, and so I finally decided I have to get a new computer to do this, so I've got a new computer, so hopefully it's going to work a lot better. So this discussion is really going to focus on Twin Peaks seasons 1 and 2, and then as far as what's going to happen with the podcast going forward when it comes to Twin Peaks content, then I will be getting to Twin Peaks Season 3 or Twin Peaks The Return. But before I do that, there are companion novels or companion books that go along with the series. And so Mark Frost, who's one of the co-creators of the show, him and David Lynch together, they created Twin Peaks. Then he published 2 different books. So initially I thought it was just the final dossier, but then I did a little bit more research, and basically how it goes is he published this book. It's called Twin Peaks, a novel, and it is I know there's a subtitle with this. It's The Secret History of Twin Peaks by Flatiron Books, I want to say. Let me just double check on that. Yeah, it's Flatiron Books, and this was published just before Season 3 of Twin Peaks came out. And as far as I understand it, what this does is this provides an interesting history of Twin Peaks between the end of Season 2 and the beginning of Season 3. So everything that happens in between. So my plan is that I'm going to read this, do a review and a discussion of it on my BookTube channel, which is the same channel. I just title the videos separately for the podcast compared to my BookTube videos. So I will do a BookTube discussion of this, and I'll get you a good look there. And then, the way it was published is it came out just before Season 3, so I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to watch Season 3, or Twin Peaks The Return. And then after that, then I'm going to read and discuss the next Mark Frost book. So this is the final dossier. So that one was published in October of 2017. So I believe it goes something like October of 2016. And then in the spring of 2017, then The Return came out. And then in the fall, in October of 2017, then the final dossier came out. So I'm going to be getting you a bunch of different Twin Peaks content coming out. Now, as far as this discussion, I've titled it How to Fall in Love with Twin Peaks. And basically, if you are here, if you're watching this video, I imagine it's for one of 2 reasons. So number 1, it's because you absolutely love Twin Peaks and you just want to hear somebody else talk about how great the show is. Or 2, it's because you've never watched Twin Peaks before and you want to get a sense of what this is about. And generally speaking, I really won't have any significant spoilers about the series. Certainly not with seasons 1 and 2. I might do that in later discussions, but for this one, it's really an introductory video of how to fall in love with Twin Peaks. Because if you fall into that second camp of somebody who has either never watched the show before, but you're interested, or you've watched a little bit of it and you just thought, this is so strange and I don't know what to do with this and I don't know that I like it and I don't get what people are seeing in it, hopefully my discussion here will help you to understand what it is that other people are seeing in Twin Peaks, and at least for myself, what I see in this show. So what I want to do is I basically want to explain to you how I approach the show and my particular reading of it. And this is not the only way to interpret the show, but this is hopefully a helpful way of understanding it. So if you have watched it at all, then you have probably noticed that it is very, very difficult to categorize Twin Peaks. What genre is it? And this is an interesting question, and because there are some people who are obsessed with genre and all of the tropes of specific genres, and then you get genre mashups, but David Lynch he is doing something, and I do give him a fair bit of credit, in part because not only did he co-create the show, so that is him and Mark Frost, but he directed significant episodes of the show. And I don't just mean that he was, doing the bulk of them, but the season premieres and season finales, and he also, as far as I understand it, he handpicked other directors to direct the episodes in between. So when I say significant episodes, I mean the most important episodes of the series were directed by David Lynch, and he had a lot of say over everything to do with the show. So I will give him a fair bit of credit. So when it comes to David Lynch and genres, then he is essentially, and I can think of no other way than, and I don't mean this in a derogatory, disrespectful way to him or to other directors, other filmmakers, but he's showing off. He's showing off in Twin Peaks, and what he's doing is he is showing I can do I can direct, I can write and direct a TV series that is going to shift from one genre to another, to another, to another, to another, and I can do it better than anybody else. That if you're just watching Twin Peaks and if you isolate specific scenes, then you say, okay, you've got all these different genres that are happening all the time, and each scene typically is tonally, as far as the overall tone of the show and different tropes that you get within it, is focusing in on a different genre. So let me give you a quick rundown of all the different genres that you're going to experience within Twin Peaks. And I'm gonna come back to these and explain it a little bit more. But first of all, you've got melodrama. It's a soap opera. It's also a murder mystery. It's a whodunit. You have detective fiction. It's a police procedural. There's romance. There's absurdist comedy. There's some slapstick in there. It has moments of being highly sincere, sentimental moments of drama. It's a supernatural thriller. It's horror. You've got serial killer fiction, demonic possession. It's got film noir elements, in particular with femme fatale, and you see this with James in season 2. It's a crime story, right? The heavy elements of it being a crime story with Ben and Jerry Horn, with Catherine Martell, with Josie and One-Eyed Jacks, all of that. And then you've got a lot of moments of camp where there's this campiness to the show, eccentric characters in general, like fitting in with that camp theme. So what you're doing then is you're looking at this and you're saying, so what is it? And this is what I love, because I have a real aversion to people who are maybe not genre snobs. That'd probably be like an incorrect way of putting it, but people who are genre obsessed, where if something doesn't fit with the particular tropes of their chosen genre, then they dislike a film or a book or a TV series, and they're like, oh, but that's not exactly what I look for when it comes to horror or fantasy or science fiction or whatever else. Like, that's not a science fiction trope, or that's not a horror trope, or there's too much comedy in that. And so essentially what's happening, though, is he is consistent with these different genres within individual scenes, but the series as a whole is exploring all of these different genres. And so you might be asking yourself this question of, why? Like, what am I supposed to do with this? If this show is jumping from one genre to another, to another, to another, then you might say, okay, that seems like it's inconsistent, and isn't that the sign of bad filmmaking? And to me, the answer is, well, no, if there, like, it can be, sure, it can be a sign of bad filmmaking. If it's unintentional, if it's just accidental, the filmmaker doesn't know what they're doing, and they've got moments that are comedic that are not supposed to be comedic, or they're just throwing things together that really don't fit. Like, you could think about, the infamous film The Room, where you've got all of these different genres going on all at once. But that's not what David Lynch is doing here. So what he's doing is hanging over all of these different genres is this big umbrella of surrealism. So surrealism is kind of hanging over the entire series. And I want to briefly explain what I mean by this. So surrealism, in case you are unfamiliar with this, like, think about paintings by Salvador Dali. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then do just, or if you can't quite remember what they look like, then do a quick search on Google. Just go to Google Images and then type in Salvador Dali, D-A-L-I, and you'll get a sense of surrealist art. So I believe it started in the early 20th century, and it's essentially what you're doing is you are combining these two, like, not necessarily two, but you're combining things together that just shouldn't fit, right? Where reality itself seems to be bending, and you're saying it looks like a dream. The way a dream and surrealism, we often use those interchangeably, as though it's one, like, they're the same thing. And that's not exactly what surrealist artists are trying to do. I believe it's a bit more complex than that. But that is a good way of understanding it, right? At least as an initial approach, is to just conceive of this as being dreamlike qualities to the show. So that's what's hanging over the entire series, is you have this sense of surrealism. So think about it this way. If you are having a dream, then you might have a dream that begins and it kind of seems a bit silly and it's kind of comedic, and maybe you're kind of having this absurd scene play out in your mind as you're dreaming, but then it shifts into something perhaps a bit frightening, or maybe there's a little bit of action that's going on, and then it shifts into something romantic, and then it becomes a horror story, and then it shifts into being funny all over again. That within a dream, one scene just blends into another. They just kind of like all bleed together. And that you've got all these different genres that are going on, like genres, so to speak, but essentially the affect on you, your feelings as you're experiencing these dreams. Think about that. Now think about Twin Peaks. So this is my interpretation of the show, my particular reading, and by no means am I the first one to say this, to put forth this idea of how to understand Twin Peaks. But imagine it this way. Every single character in Twin Peaks, they are all experiencing this shared dream, this shared surreal moment together, right? Or series of moments. The entire town of Twin Peaks is under this entire fog of surrealism. And for the most part, then the characters within the show are staying fairly consistent within whatever dream they're having. So if you look at this, so somebody like, if we're looking at James, for instance, and James and Donna, then they are, for the most part, having this tragic dream of losing, their one of their best friends, but it's also a romantic dream as they fall in love, but then there's heartbreak within there. That it stays fairly consistent. There's a lot of tragedy, there's a lot of horror to this, of, oh no, we've lost our friend, but then you do have these moments of romance, and there's a lot of melancholy that they're experiencing. So you've got that, but then you look at somebody like Deputy Andy, and his is very much a comedic dream, right? Nadine, in a lot of ways, is just such a silly, eccentric character who's very much having just this absurd comedic dream that is her life within Twin Peaks. So let me come back to these genres, and then I want to explain a little bit more about surrealism and the purpose behind this. But if you're looking at this, then the show it's dealing with a lot of melodrama. Melodrama is in excess of affect, as in these characters are feeling everything and it's so over the top, right? That's really what melodrama is. When and you'll say that to people, like, oh, you're being melodramatic, right? Like, this is just over the top. One way to think about this is, if you've ever seen the film This Is Spinal Tap, or even if not, then you might know the reference, where you have the idea of turning it up to 11, right? Because I believe he's the lead guitar player in the film. Then he's got all these different amps in his room, and it's a mockumentary, and he's talking to the filmmaker, the narrator of this, and then he's showing all these different amps. They go up to 10 as far as the volume, that you can crank it up to 10. And he's like, but that one goes up to 11. He's like, because sometimes you're playing and you're at 10 and you're just like, I want more power, and that one goes up to 11. He's like, but isn't that still just maximum power? You've just added in a number. And I was like, yeah, but that one goes up to 11. Like, obviously it's not going to make it louder just because he added an extra number on there if the amp has the same actual projection of sound, right? But in his head, you're cranking it all the way up and then some. That's essentially what melodrama is. It's everything's maxed out to 11. Now, you might say, yeah, I don't like soap operas. I don't like melodrama. I don't like it when something just seems like, man, that person's feeling way too much for what's going on. But think about how well this pairs with horror. Horror is cranked up to 11. There is no mistaking what characters are feeling in a horror film. There's no mistaking it. You can't say like, "Oh, how do they feel about this?" Right? Somebody is like shrieking their head off. They are terrified. They're screaming. They're running. They're panting. They are terrified out of their minds, and you can see this so visibly within a horror film. There's no mistaking what they are feeling. That is a soap opera. That is melodrama. There is no mistaking. There's very little subtlety. Even like when you do have some subtle moments within a melodrama, those knowing looks that actors will give the camera. Generally speaking, it's pretty hard to miss something in a soap opera. It's all right there. But that does pair really well with horror. So in Twin Peaks, and you do have a lot of moments of melodrama and these soap opera elements. And even the show within the show that you see on television all the time, that, with that, then you've got a soap opera literally playing out in Twin Peaks. So it's a melodrama, it's a soap opera, it's a murder mystery, right? It's a whodunit with the death of Laura and Dale Cooper being there to investigate. Now, as far as that, this is an interesting little like piece of history within the show. If you're not familiar with this, that apparently there was quite the debate between the two creators of the show, of Mark Frost and David Lynch, on whether they would actually reveal who the killer is of Laura Palmer. Now, I'm not going to tell you who that is, because like I say, I am trying to treat this fairly spoiler free, which I don't often do on the podcast, but I'm trying to do this as an introduction to Twin Peaks to try to give you a sense of how to even watch this show. So when it comes to the murder mystery, then David Lynch said, I don't ever want to reveal it. That really for him, it was an entry point into Twin Peaks to get to know all of the different characters. That essentially it is a bait and switch, right? That he's baiting the audience, saying, hey, you want to know who killed the homecoming queen, right? You want to know who killed this girl in this small town where, nothing wrong should ever happen, right? Everything should be really nice and pleasant in this small town. That's why you escape the big city with all of its crime and violence, and then you move to a place like Twin Peaks where things like that just don't happen. And he's like, people will come and they'll be interested in that. And then what ends up happening is you start learning the sordid history, the sordid drama going on within this town of all of these different characters. And then you start getting interested in all of these other characters in town. And so he's like, and then we won't even get to it. We won't even get to who killed Laura Palmer. And Mark Frost and the producers at CBS were saying, no, we can't do that. We've got to reveal this to the audience, right? And David Lynch, I believe he said in one of his interviews that essentially it was killing the goose that was laying the golden eggs, that he thought this whole mystery, the whodunit of Twin Peaks, this murder mystery of, that it's somebody in town, but you don't know who, and so everybody's kind of a suspect, and everything they do is a little bit suspicious. He's like, once we reveal that, it ruins everything. But in any case, you do have a lot of moments like that. It's detective fiction, right? And some strange detective fiction too, that at some moments then it is detective fiction and it's police procedural and it's very much by the book, and you're collecting evidence and building a case and following different clues and interviews with different subjects. So there are elements of, it's a pretty straightforward police procedural. At the same time, some of the tactics that Dale Cooper employs are so strange, with his, following these dreams that he has, the clues that he's getting from his dreams, and just following that through and saying, Harry, this is how we're going to do it. And, like throwing rocks to figure out who is most likely to have been associated with Laura Palmer, with murdering her. And it's like that he's got those tactics as well. And so that's where you get into some of the absurdist elements to the show. You've also got moments of romance. And I don't just mean, you might think, oh, well, that's all covered under melodrama and the soap opera elements. It's like, no, there's a difference between melodrama and a pretty sincere, subtle romance, or even if it's not subtle, but a pretty sincere romance. And if you look at the really good example of this is what happens between Ed and Norma. That's a really, really interesting romantic storyline that you have, because the more you get into their own personal history of how they ended up with other people, and they both have got pretty good a pretty strong sense of their own ethics, their own character, and having integrity, that they're being faithful to these spouses that they really never should have been with in the first place, right? That they were teenagers, and they have this, and I hope that I'm not spoiling too much, because it's not really much of a spoiler. You do get this pretty early on in the series, but essentially you've got these two people where they're teenagers and they have a fight, and from that fight, their lives go in an entirely different direction, and them fighting for their own happiness, for their own romance, to be with the person who they really should have been with in the first place. Like, those are pretty sincere moments, and there's a lot of subtlety to that when they can't be together. You do get these subtle little, you see like little touching of the hands, little like knowing looks, but they're trying to keep it quiet. And so you've got some subtle romance going on there, and overt romance as well within the series. Like I say, you've got absurdist comedy. You've got, whether it's Andy or Nadine as well. They're pretty silly characters. So for them, their dream is this silly, absurd dream that they're having. Ed and Norma, they're having a romantic dream. Then you've got highly sincere, sentimental moments of drama throughout the series. You've got these thriller elements, and specifically, it's a supernatural thriller. You've got a lot of horror. Like I say, it is serial killer fiction, but it's also demonic possession. And this is, like I say, this is David Lynch really showing off. Essentially, what I think he's doing is he's showing, I can make a better horror film, a better horror TV series than most horror directors. And I can make a better romance than most romance directors. I can make a better comedic or absurdist comedy from scene to scene than comedy directors. I can make a better police procedural than most directors of police procedurals. I can make better detective fiction, a better murder mystery. I can do a better soap opera than people who make soap operas. He's showing this pretty deep knowledge, not only of what these genres are, but how they function, the overall tone, the overall approach to this. And he is just shifting between one and the other and the other. And he just goes from that. Sometimes within scenes, as you shift, let's say if you're in the Double R Diner, then you might be focusing on a couple characters who are having this romantic moment, but then you shift over to these characters who are having a melodramatic moment, and then you shift to these characters who are having this police procedural moment, right? That we're moving from one genre to another, and he's doing it, it's not exactly seamlessly, but it's at least smoothly. He is moving fairly smoothly from one to the other. And there are seams to it, and the seams to it would be the music, that you get these musical cues, which we're going to talk about in a minute here. But I just want to finish off here with the genres. So you're also looking at film noir. You've got James, like I say, in the second season, you get the femme fatale, and so he's showing I can make a film noir story just as well as any director from the 50s, right? And you get other elements of that, of like these teenage dramas and comedies from the 50s, especially like anytime he goes into the high school, with the musical cues that you get there and the way a lot of the characters are dressed, with like the big skirts and all of that it very much, and the sweaters and like cardigans, and it looks very much like the aesthetic of the 1950s from these teen movies. So he's got those elements. There's a lot of crime fiction in this. It's very much a crime story, like I say. Everything that's going on with One-Eyed Jacks, with the mill, between Ben and Jerry Horn and Catherine Martell and Josie. And so for all of those characters, that's the dream that they're locked into, right? And then and the point here is, this is not me just pointing out that there is surrealism without any evidence for it. The characters themselves seem to be questioning their own reality and what's happening within the series. That you've got, I believe it's Donna who first says, that this is the most wonderful dream and the most terrible nightmare. And Audrey talks about that dreamy music. Don't you just love that dreamy music? The way, and she just starts dancing. You get multiple characters who are dancing, and you're like, are they hearing the music that we're hearing? This whole diegetic and non-diegetic sense of music. Is that what they're hearing? Are other characters in this town hearing it? Like when you see Audrey dancing, you're like, do the other characters in the Double R Diner, did they hear this or not? Ben and Jerry Horn, they dance. Leland certainly dances. You see even Dale Cooper, he dances at various times, like not a dance, right? But he's got that music playing, right? Of like, you see him like kind of snapping his fingers after he like wakes up from the dream with that jazz music, because you've got, you've got, what is his name? But sorry, it's been a little bit since I rewatched the series, but in his dream, then you've got, the little man, can't remember his name, but anyway, in the red suit where he's dancing, right? So you have a lot of characters who are hearing this music, and there is this ambiguity where it's unclear whether it is diegetic or non-diegetic music, whether the characters within the show are hearing it or whether they're hearing the same music that we're hearing. And that's where I'm finding this evidence that they are all locked into this big dream, but each one of their dreams are different tones, different themes, a different affect, a different feeling that they're experiencing. So part of it is, when you're looking at it, then you're saying, okay, so these are all the surreal elements. Now, why is David Lynch doing that? So are you saying that the whole thing is a dream? And I'm saying, no, not necessarily, because there is an element to that perhaps this is all a dream. And that if you're thinking about somebody like Carl Jung, who, he was a psychologist, and he had this theory of the collective unconscious. And so Carl Jung's theory is that the idea that our own mind is just locked into our own cranium, that it's impossible to have a shared thought, some kind of telepathy with other people. Then he's like, well, no, there seems to be something deep down in the human mind where we have these shared memories, and that's where he comes up with the theory of archetypes, that we just recognize certain archetypes, certain characters throughout different stories and history, and we just recognize people when we go, oh, okay, that's who that person is, that's who that person is. And he's like, where did that come from? That there's something that we all share in our mind that came from who knows where, but we're all sharing that. But at the same time, there's also this idea that perhaps when we're sleeping, then we might be tapping into other people's dreams, right? That there's that part of it as well. So it could be that. It could be this Jungian idea of the collective unconscious that everybody in Twin Peaks is all experiencing. That perhaps it is just one big dream. Okay, so that was 30 minutes. Let me keep going here. But the other part of it, though, is I think that he's playing with the idea, it's Cartesian epistemology. And so what I mean by that is Rene Descartes the 17th century French mathematician and philosopher who came up, like you would recognize it of, cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am. And it very famously gets reworked in The Matrix, with everybody is locked into the Matrix, but it's all this shared delusion that's not really reality, and then they get unplugged and you're like, here's what reality is. So keep that in mind, but let me briefly explain what Descartes is doing with this. So Descartes he questions reality itself. So epistemology is the philosophical, the branch of philosophy in which you explore, how do we know what we know? How do we trust what is true? What is knowledge? What we can rely upon? What we can, physically, like not necessarily physically, but intellectually lean on? Where is our support? Where is our foundation? How can we trust things that we believe to be true to actually be true? And Descartes begins with this principle of skepticism, that you have to be skeptical of everything, that you have to doubt everything, that you can't trust your senses because your senses can lie to you all the time. And then he's saying, and how do we even know that we're not locked into this whole big shared delusion that some little demon has, we're all just characters within this demon's dream, or that that we're not real, and other people that we're dealing with, they're not real either, that it's all this false reality. How can we know if we're even living in reality or not? Think about that with Twin Peaks. These characters talk about this all the time. They talk about how strange this is. Everything in Twin Peaks is a little off. It's not a typical direct narrative. There's just so many strange moments, so many strange characters doing strange things. And it's not just that there's some kooky characters in this town, it's that the town itself just seems like everything that's happening in there just seems a little off. And all of the characters seem to know something's a little funny here. Whatever's going on in Twin Peaks is different from what you would expect. So they've got some skepticism. They really do. They've got some doubt over whether this is reality, whether this is their real life or not. I mean, at one point, then Jerry Horn says that to Ben. He's like, is this real life or is this a dream? Like something along those lines. That's in the second season, where he directly asked that question. And you should be watching the show asking yourself that question too. The purpose here, my point is, when you watch Twin Peaks, don't just watch it and think, okay, this is all reality. And so when it becomes melodramatic, you say, well, people don't act that way. And it's like, yeah, they don't act that way. So what's going on? Whether it's these moments of, melodrama or horror or slapstick absurdist comedy, you say, well, that's not realistic. Like, you look at Andy. Like, Andy is, for much of the time, if not all of the time, he is not a realistic character in any way. And even Dale Cooper, with his ridiculous exuberance over everything, like, he's still not really that realistic. You can't imagine that there is an FBI agent who's anything like him, right? But he's fun, he's delightful, but he's not very realistic. And so I'm saying, these are all of your clues that this is not supposed to be depicting reality as we experience it, that there's something else going on here. And my point here is that what Descartes was suggesting is that he comes to his conclusion that the fact that I can doubt my own reality, that I can doubt my own existence, proves that I am at least having thoughts that are originating in my mind. Nobody else put that thought into my head. And if there was this little demon who was creating this false reality that I'm living within, or that I'm just a projection of that demon's mind, then why would he give me the ability to doubt reality itself? So that's where he ends up coming to his conclusion. I think, therefore I am. That if I have these thoughts, I don't know about everybody else, but I know at least for myself, I must really exist. So that's kind of Descartes' way of escaping this question of the nature of reality. Now, my point is that for the characters within Twin Peaks, they don't know if it's a dream or not, but it doesn't matter. Because you might say, so if the whole thing's a dream, then the entire thing becomes meaningless. And a lot of people feel that way about TV shows that will have, you have a character, you have a dream sequence, and then, maybe like a character dies, and then you're like, oh no, the main character is dead. And then they wake up, and you're like, oh, that last sequence was completely meaningless. Or you might be watching an entire film, and then at the end of it, it's like, oh, it turns out that was just some dream that the character had. And you go, so this whole thing was just meaningless? It was all made up? I want to comment on this idea. So this is just, perhaps me being pedantic about this, but the idea that all fiction is made up, for one thing, right? So when you've got characters in a TV show, a movie, a book, where you've got these dream sequences, and then people get frustrated, and then they just say, well, it was all made up. And it's like, well, what do you think the entire thing is? They're all fictional characters. The entire thing is fiction. But you're saying the fiction within the fiction is, that's your issue, right? And to some extent, and I think that's fair, right? I think very few people enjoy dream sequences, especially when they're fake outs, when they're trying to get you to think something's happening that you just know is not really happening. Like, you're not killing the main character at this point in the movie, or you're just not going to kill the main character at all because it's one of those kinds of movies. So that's not what Twin Peaks is, though. It's not a fake out, because at no point is anybody waking up from this, if it is a dream. Nobody's waking up from it. But this is why I'm trying to say that it's not even exactly it's not a dream. It's surrealism. And it's playing with Descartes' theory of what is the nature of reality and how can we trust what reality actually is. So the point here is that within Twin Peaks, there are stakes. Laura, when she dies, is gone. She's not coming back. To be fair, she kind of sort of comes back in a very surreal way in the character of Maddie, her cousin. But she doesn't come back, let's say. And so other characters who die within the series, although it does play with this because there's a lot of people who die, but then they come back because they weren't really dead. But my point here is there are plenty of characters who die, who really do die, who really don't come back, right? There are plenty of characters within the show where that does happen to them. And so they can't get out of their dream. There is no moment where they all wake up. There is no, the harps start playing and then you get that like wispy effect on the screen and it's as you're coming out of a dream. None of that happens within the show. That whether they're in a dream or not, it doesn't matter to them because they can't get out of this thing. They can't get out of it. And the only thing that they can really trust is what's happening to them. And they can see other people having very, very different dreams, but it's like, it doesn't matter. You can't jump into Andy's dream of this silliness that he's dealing with, just like he's not jumping into somebody else's nightmare. They're all kind of locked into this thing that it is this collective surrealist aura hanging over the entire town of Twin Peaks. When you understand that, when you treat the show like that, when you understand that not everything you see on screen is necessarily supposed to be accurately depicting reality as we experience it, then you might enjoy the series a lot more. You might say, oh, okay, that's the internal logic of the show of how to actually appreciate it, how to deal with this. Because otherwise, if you're saying, isn't this show just trying to represent reality? And you're saying, but that's so weird. These melodramatic moments, they don't make sense. And that's weird too. That doesn't make sense. That's not how you should approach the show. The other thing too is you get all of these different shifts. And like I said before, these shifts are being noted by these musical cues. And so the musical cues, what they're doing is, it is so over the top, it's cranked up to 11. You might look at this, and especially if you're watching it for the first time, then you're just like, man, does that music ever stop? And it's the music by, the score is Angelo Badalamenti, I believe is how you pronounce his name. And then Julie Cruz, I do want to mention her as well, that you see her as the blonde lead singer of the band in the Roadhouse, and that they're performing, like she's performing in the show, and like she's actually the one who's singing those songs. And then Angelo Badalamenti, then he's done the score for this, and David Lynch had a fair bit of influence with Badalamenti when he was actually composing the score to it. But it really does seem overproduced. And what I mean by overproduced, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but it is so over the top. It's so over the top. And you might look at that and you just say, so this is just the sign of bad directing. And there's way too much dependence on musical cues to tell you what to feel, what to experience, what the genre is, how to interpret this scene, that it's hitting you over the head. And this is not unusual in David Lynch films. And what it is it is tied into this surrealist element. That surrealism, very much like horror, because think about if you're having a nightmare, everything is cranked up to 11. Everything feels so much, and that's the idea behind this, is that these musical cues are overproduced. It is just hitting you over the head with affect, with feeling, with emotion. And it's, to me, that's what makes the show so fun. And what I mean by that is, it's, in a way, it's so intense, almost like if you're on a thrill ride at an amusement park, like on a roller coaster or something like that. It's just, you can't get bored from this, because it's just like going full bore all the time with theme, with tone, with genre. It's just, pay attention to me, this is romance. Pay attention to me, this is comedy. Pay attention to me, this is horror, right? That he is flooring it the entire time, and I think it really, really works. It even works when you're binge watching it, which is crazy, because most things before streaming services existed, or before really DVDs existed where you could buy an entire series, then most shows that were being aired weekly on television do not translate well to binge watching. They just don't hold up. But boy, oh boy, does Twin Peaks ever hold up to this. And that, to me, shows just what an excellent director and filmmaker David Lynch really is. So I think that's what's going on with it. But David Lynch is doing this with other things too. It's not just the music that seems like over the top and overproduced. He oversaturates his the mise en scène often, and that's like what you see on screen, and like set decoration and costumes and lighting and all of that. You'll notice that you get these highly saturated colors, like these deep reds that just take up the entire screen. Or certainly like when you're in the Black Lodge, then where you get like the red curtains and the black and white zigzag patterns on the floor. It's impossible to mistake that. When you're watching that, there's no way that you look at that and you don't notice the color of the room. But think about other TV shows that you like. Think about what the color of the room is. What are the color of their walls? Are they white? Are they off-white, taupe, beige, light yellow, blue, light green? Like, what are they? And it's like, oh, it's because you're not supposed to be paying attention to the colors of that. But David Lynch is like, pay attention to this, pay attention to everything. And he's forcing us to do that all the time. And to me, that's very much an element of horror. It's focusing our attention, saying, look at this thing, and then playing ominous music, and then you're going like, what am I looking at? Why are you forcing me to look at this? Whether it's the stoplight, the flashing red of the empty intersection at night, whether it's the trees, the Douglas firs that are like blowing in the wind, and it's just like, pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. In the Palmer house, when you've got that angle looking up at the stairs, and you just like, he's pumping up the sound of the fan, the ceiling fan at the top of the stairs is whoa, 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 whoa. You shouldn't be able to hear that from that perspective at the bottom of the stairs. He's cranking everything up. It's pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. And you're watching it, you're going like, but what am I paying attention to? What's the significance of this? And it's just, everything is maxing out on meaning, on symbolism, and saying, think about it. What does that mean? What does that represent? Why am I forcing you to look at this? That's how you should be watching the show, is thinking those things all the time, going, he's interested in this. Why? What's going on? what is he trying to tell me that I don't already know, right? And when I say he, I do mean David Lynch. But like I say, there's plenty of other directors who did direct other episodes, and writers, like not the least of which would be Mark Frost, who was heavily involved with this, and the actors as well. I'm not trying to give too much credit just to one individual, because of course film and television is a collaborative medium. But that is a big part of what I want you to consider with it. Okay, so that takes care of a lot of it. I want to kind of give you a little bit of an overview of the importance of Twin Peaks, if you did not already know. And I'm sure there may be other people who have done a better job of this, but hopefully I've got at least some things that I'm adding to the discussion that other people have not quite added. So in terms of the legacy of Twin Peaks, it's important to appreciate the show for what it is. And so an example of this is that you get a lot of different things in Twin Peaks that other TV shows just did not do. But you get really for the first time, or at least you get most fully realized within Twin Peaks, all of these things combined together that we just recognize as being signifiers of really great television series. So you get an ensemble cast. You get lots and lots and lots of characters who are very different from each other. They all have unique voices. They've got backstories, which you slowly reveal, which are slowly being revealed to you. But you've got all this diverse ensemble cast, right? And I don't, like, when I say diverse, I'm not just talking about like gender or ethnicity. I just mean that like these are characters like from a whole bunch of different ages, different backgrounds, different goals and purposes in life. They're all experiencing very different things during the runtime of the story that we get within Twin Peaks. So you get an ensemble cast. Very few shows had a cast the size of Twin Peaks, and he is employing basically everyone. It's hard to even point out, aside from a couple of the characters, like aside from Dale Cooper, you kind of look at this and then you just say, okay, so who are you go like major characters, minor characters, and then background characters. But it's like, what's the difference between the major and the minor characters within the show? Because it seems like you've got just a whole bunch of major characters, or even characters who don't get a lot of screen time, are still getting pretty involved backstories. That really, everyone is important within this. Just like in the real world, that no one should feel like they are a minor character in their own existence. We're all the star of our own film, right? And that's the approach that David Lynch essentially is taking with all these characters. So you've got this ensemble cast. It's storytelling, serialized storytelling. It's not episodic, as in you can't just watch these in any random order. It's not a monster of the week. It's not just like, okay, everything's going to be wrapped up by the end of this. And to me, I have so much respect for David Lynch and the producers of the show believing in this and believing in him and Mark Frost and their vision for this, that they did not insist that it all has to get wrapped up, because this is actually respecting the audience and respecting the intelligence of the audience. For instance, if you're watching, and I'm not trying to pick on any particular show, but this is a good example of it. If you're watching something like CSI, then there is, to me, no respect for the patience of the audience. There's no respect to say, oh, don't worry, you can have a murder that takes place either just before the show starts and the investigators show up at the beginning of the episode, and then as far as the runtime of the show, we're going to reveal this 37 minutes later. Right? Then we're going to tell you who the murderer is and exactly how they did it and why they did it, means, motive, all of that stuff. That we'll delay it that long. We'll wait until the end of the episode. But we're not like, it's pretty rare if you're ever going to get it into a 2-part episode. David Lynch was like, we'll never reveal who the killer is. But even when they do end up revealing it, and I won't say who, but you're pretty deep into the second season. So he's like, people will wait a year and a half to find out the entire premise of the show. It's like, they'll be patient. As far as runtime, he's like, oh, sure, they can wait 15 hours before finding out who the killer is. And he does this with all kinds of the storylines. He doesn't repeat things. That if you're not paying attention, he's not going to come back and remind you. You're not going to have characters saying the same thing again and again and again. And a new character comes into, or a recurring character comes into a scene, and then say the person's name, remind the audience who they are, why they're here, what's going on with them, their backstory. That's where most TV shows before DVDs and before streaming services, that's why they don't hold up to binge watching, because there's so much repetition. Because it's like, well, it's been, for most audience members, maybe 2, 3, 4 weeks since they last were paying attention to this character, so we have to remind them who they are, and we have to kind of repeat things. David Lynch is like, we're not repeating anything. Everything is going to be said once on screen, and you better be paying attention. If you're not paying attention, you're going to be lost pretty quickly. And I love that. I love the fact that he actually trusts that we're intelligent and that we're patient and that we can actually follow along with that. So it's serial storytelling. It's not episodic. Again, think about how great television shows today from like the last 20 years, what they have done and how this matches up with what Twin Peaks was doing in the early 90s. You've got these really complex storylines. You've got high-profile actors, right? This was rarely done in television up until this point. Film actors who are in the show, and actors who've been around for a long time. Very prominent actors who were cast in the show. And I'm using the gender-neutral term of actors, right? I still tend to prefer actors and actresses, but I want to distinguish that I'm not ignoring all of the female actresses or actors within the show, but it's just that's what we're supposed to say now is actors instead of actor, actress. So you've also got daring, bold storytelling with the stuff that he showed on screen, whether you're talking about some of the morgue scenes, with Laura, or some of the horror elements that you get with it, whether you're dealing with Bob or whatever else, that some of that stuff was pretty bold to put on television. Okay, so there's all of that I really enjoy. The other thing too, and I think this is kind of a good, bad, one of these things holds up, the other one doesn't hold up so well, I think. The portrayal of people with disabilities and mental illness. So he does a great job, not just he, the entire crew of Twin Peaks do a great job in the portrayal of people with physical disabilities. And I think that you look at this and I think it's better than what you see in almost anything. So what I mean by this is you've got Nadine, for instance, who's got the eye patch. She's you do eventually find out why she's got the eye patch, but there's really no comment on it. No one really comments on it for quite a while. And then when they do comment on it, then it's just one of those things of it's an identifier for Nadine. It's like, oh, isn't she the woman with the eye patch? But that's it. There's no mockery, there's no bullying, but it's also not putting that element of her physical appearance to be in such a place of prominence that's her purpose in the show. That it's like, let's make sure that we've got a diverse cast with physical disabilities. It's just, yeah, some people have physical disabilities. You meet them. Like, so what? That doesn't change anything about who they are, their motivations, who they are as a person, like who they're in love with and what they want out of life. And you get that with Nadine. Even though she's a pretty silly character for much of the show, then she's got her ambition, she's got her dream, she's got this invention with the drape runners, right? And trying to have them run as silent as possible. And that's going to make them all of this money. And she does seem to really care for Ed, although there is some hostility there in the marriage. But, there's nothing about her really to do with the fact that she's only got one eye. And isn't that great? Isn't that, like, in that way, it's representing reality pretty well. And then you've also got Eileen Hayward, Donna's wife, Donna's mother, the doctor's wife, Eileen Hayward, where she's in a wheelchair. And again, there's really no comment on it at all. I don't think there's ever any comment, or like there might be a comment about her being in a wheelchair, but as far as the background of how that happened or anything, just nope. Just some people are physically, like, deal with physical impairments, and some people do have mobility issues and are in wheelchairs. They use wheelchairs. So she's one of them. That's it. So I think that does a really good job, because I think a lot of people today try to incorporate there's more and more of a move to incorporate you know, people who do have physical disabilities, to have them be portrayed well on screen. And it's kind of sad that in 2019 we're still having that conversation. You look at this and you're like, in 1990 and 1991 it was being done, as far as I can tell, and I have not heard criticism of this, being done in a pretty respectful, pretty realistic way, and it wasn't pandering in any way. It's just like, yeah. So I'm like, that part holds up really well. The stuff that I think doesn't hold up as well, it would be more people with mental illness. And I don't think that it's being done poorly, and I don't really have an issue with it. But I mean, Harold Smith, who is the, as far as I can tell, an agoraphobic shut-in, right? That's his issue, is agoraphobia. It's kind of strange because the characters in Twin Peaks, on the one hand, then they are very respectful of people with physical disabilities, but then people who are dealing with a mental illness, then they behave as though they've never heard of this before. Like the way people talk about Harold, like, something happened to him, he just can't leave his place. What do you mean he can't leave his place? And I feel like, shouldn't we, even in like the early 90s, wasn't it just like, yeah, it's agoraphobia. Some people just, they get such terrible, crippling social anxiety that they cannot stand being in wide open spaces or in crowded environments, and so they need to stay at home. Like, yeah, I don't know why that's so mysterious. Like, you're talking about a person, you know, like with like 3 heads or something. Like, it's that seems a little off to me. But you do get this contrasted with the log lady. Now, whether I believe her name is Margaret, because I believe Dale does make the distinction to stop calling her the log lady and he calls her Margaret. They refer to her as the log lady. But, so on the one hand, yes, there is that. But on the other hand, then there is some noticing of her being a little bit strange. But I guess my point here is, does she have a mental illness, or is she just tuned into this whole other level of reality that is going on, that, you know, the Air Force with the Major is aware of, and that Dale is kind of getting tapped into? That is she just experiencing something that really is going on within Twin Peaks, or is she completely out there, right? And so I think that really, like, where the show seems to land on this is that she does not have a mental illness. She's just tapped into this other thing. But as far as other people in town, then they must think this, and they are pretty respectful of her, right? You don't get a lot of mockery of her. You don't really see, although they do refer to her as a log lady, but for whatever that's worth, right? Because they don't refer to Nadine as the one-eyed lady, right? But they do refer to Margaret as the log lady. So I don't know about that portrayal. And even if it's being portrayed in a slightly offensive way, I don't think that means that it's bad. Okay, I genuinely don't think that. It's interesting to point out, like, what is, in terms of 2019, how does this hold up in terms of taste, and how culture insists on things being portrayed compared to, you know, from like almost 30 years ago. And so some of it does a really good job. Other parts, I think people would have more of an issue with it. And then like Leland, the way everything to do with Leland. And he doesn't get a lot of, people are trying to hide how broken he is at this point. Not so much with his wife, but with him. People do not like his public outbursts, specifically Ben and Jerry Horn, but you have others who are trying to keep him from being as strange as he's being. And so it's just there seems to be much more discomfort with how do you deal with people who are dealing with mental illness compared to somebody who's dealing with a physical impairment. So it's just something to consider. Now, as far as that whole legacy of all of these different elements that you have with the show, then I just want to kind of like run down all these different shows where I think you really get to see this. So for one thing, like when we're talking about the ensemble cast, serial storytelling, complex storylines requiring audiences to pay attention, high profile actors, daring bold storytelling, the portrayal of people with disabilities, mental illness, think about all of those different things. And here's kind of a rundown of different shows where these are just shows that I'm pretty familiar with, and I'm sure there's plenty of others, but there's no way that you can look at this and say Twin Peaks did not lay the groundwork for these shows. So Northern Exposure is one of my favorite TV shows of all time, if not my absolute favorite. And this was concurrent with Twin Peaks on the same network, filmed like an hour away from each other, but you get a lot of the same elements in Northern Exposure in terms of the ensemble cast. A lot of it is, there's a fair bit of serial storytelling. There's a lot of episodic storytelling as well, but complex storylines, high profile actors, daring bold storytelling. The X-Files as well. The X-Files does have a lot of episodic elements to it, but they've got the grand arc of what's going on in terms of the abduction of Mulder's sister and the government cover-up with this, the whole big conspiracy of the government, the military, and their relationship with extraterrestrials. That, and I know that other people have done this where they've outlined how you can watch, like just pointing out, watch this episode, this one, this one, this one, this one, and then you get the whole storyline within the X-Files of what's really going on with that big storyline. So you've got that with the X-Files, certainly, and this is jumping ahead, but certainly with the Sopranos, right? And that's the big show that a lot of people think about as being the advent of the golden age of television, and certainly serial drama television, that The Sopranos is the show that's just like, that is what started it. And in a lot of ways, yes, like as far as modern, brilliant storytelling being portrayed on television, then it's right there. But I'm saying that foundation, I think, was really laid with David Lynch and with Twin Peaks. And what I mean by that is Twin Peaks proves that audiences are intelligent. Audiences will pay attention. They will stick with a storyline. You can give us complex characters. You can give us morally complex characters. You can give us, you don't have to treat us like dummies. You can give us lines of dialogue a single time, introduce a character a single time, and we're going to remember who they are. You don't have to continue to repeat yourself. You don't have to dumb it down. And if some people can't follow along, then they're not the right audience for this show, right? There's plenty of other shows that are much easier to follow along with than something like Twin Peaks or The Sopranos or, you know, The X-Files or whatever else. But it shows there is an audience for this. There are plenty of people who will enjoy this. Dexter is another good example of a lot of these elements. Breaking Bad, obviously, is a great example of this. Game of Thrones is a great example. Think about all the different storylines, complex characters, the ensemble cast, it's serial storytelling, it's, you know, high-profile actors, portrayal of people with disabilities. I mean, like, come on, it's got, like, everything there. The Wire, Sons of Anarchy, The Walking Dead. One of the reasons why I'm bringing out The Walking Dead, because even though it is gone so bad, I've heard that it's turned around, but I'm still in like season 8 of it, and I obviously, if you know my channel at all or my background, then I wrote my master's research project on The Walking Dead comics, so I know a lot about the series, and both the comic series and the television show. But the interesting thing with The Walking Dead is just that Robert Kirkman, the writer of the comics, then he had the vision for The Walking Dead that it would be a bait and switch, just like with, he didn't say just like with Twin Peaks, but I'm saying this, that it's the same idea that David Lynch had. He's like, people will come for the zombies, but they'll stay for the characters. David Lynch is like, people will come for the murder of the homecoming queen, but they're going to stay for the characters. The same idea, and if you've been watching the show, or even certainly it shows up in the show a lot more in the comics, but the show, it's like it's not really about the zombies anymore. It stopped being about the zombies a long time ago, and it's really about the characters. And whether you like that or not, it is the same approach. It's pull them in with this, very compelling premise, but then say, but it's not really about that. This is just a method to get you to learn about all the different characters within this universe, and then you're going to be interested in what happens with them. So that's why I'm bringing up The Walking Dead there and its connection to Twin Peaks. The killing is like it's certainly not dealing with anything surreal, but the killing, if you've watched that, then you know it's got a lot of crossover with Twin Peaks. Bates Motel does the same kind of thing with a small town, all these strange things going on there. Hannibal, if you have not watched Hannibal, you owe it to yourself to watch it, especially if you enjoy the horror elements of Twin Peaks, because Hannibal is such a great TV series, and early on, it's a lot of it is a police procedural, but then it ends up shifting into being really, really strange, like Twin Peaks, where you're just watching stuff on screen and you're going like, I never would have imagined anything like this, that I don't even know what I'm looking at much of the time, because you just kind of have to watch the series to know what I'm talking about, and I hope it's not too gruesome for me to bring this up. But basically, you have very, very creative and dramatic theatrical serial killers in Hannibal. And so some of the stuff that you see on screen, you're just like, I can't believe they're actually showing me this, but okay. And I mean, even though like Twin Peaks is very tame by today's standards, but you do get to see, at the time, it was pretty bold, and producers were not sure that it would be okay to portray some of the stuff on screen that they ended up portraying. But in Hannibal, it's I think continuing in that legacy. Supernatural is a really good example as well of, it's similar to the X-Files, where you've got episodic elements to it, where it is a monster of the week, but there's the big overall storyline that's happening. And typically that goes season by season, that this is the big storyline for this season. But you do, like I say, it's similar to the X-Files in that sense, that there is a lot of serial storytelling within that as well. And Lost as well. I don't know if I mentioned that, 'cause it's kind of over in like my margins here, but Lost, obviously, with the ensemble cast, serial storytelling, complex storylines, requiring audiences to pay attention, high profile actors. I mean, portrayal of people with disabilities, like most profoundly with John Locke on the show. But yeah, there's plenty to it, and Desmond too, with being stranded as long as he is. Okay, now just two more things. So, brilliant moments. These are some of my favorite moments from seasons 1 and 2 of Twin Peaks. Julie Cruz performing at the Roadhouse. I love every time she performs on screen. Those moments of the way, especially, and I'm trying not to give too much away, but I would say my favorite moment of the entire series, at least top 2, but I would say it's probably my favorite moment of the entire series, is when I believe it's Dale, Harry, and maybe it's Hawk who's sitting beside them, and they're in the Roadhouse. Julie Cruz and the band are playing, and then everything dims, and then you've got the giant on stage who's looking at Dale, and then he just says, and this is not revealing too much, and it is happening again. It is happening again, right? And then it like pulls back into the reality, that the surreal reality of Twin Peaks. And then you have the elderly housekeeper, butler figure who comes over to Dale, and he just makes such deep eye contact, and he just says, I'm so sorry. And Dale doesn't know what's happening, and you know what's happening because it's being cross-cut with what's really going on. it is just such a brilliant moment of those shifts that you get. You could study that for quite a while and continue, like as a filmmaker, especially if you are a young developing filmmaker, you could study that for a while and learn a lot about editing, the use of music, lighting, writing, having patience in how you reveal things, having that dramatic irony that the audience knows something that the characters don't know, how to build both intensity and sadness and horror all at once. It is one of the absolute best moments in the entire series, at least in my opinion. And so that's, again, without really spoiling it. I was sure that it was Mike. Yeah, so the little person who is dancing in the red suit. So that's Mike, who's dancing in the red room when Dale has his dream. I believe that's at the end of episode 3 in season 1. And when Mike doing the backwards talking, right, that they filmed the whole thing, like that they recorded it where he spoke backwards, and I believe that they filmed it backwards, and then, or that like they basically reversed the order of it. It's been a while since I've explored this, so I apologize for kind of stumbling over that. But basically, everything he does, it's all in reverse, right? That you're seeing it being played at normal speed, but backwards. And so that's where you get these really, really strange moments in, the red room, and just that entire dream sequence, and then coming back to that later on. But Dale in that dream and then him waking up, it's just, I love that scene so much. And I remember when I first watched Twin Peaks, I was dubious about the show for a while. I really was. I was really unsure, how do I feel about this show? And I couldn't figure out whether it was the most brilliant thing I'd ever seen or whether it was just the worst filmmaking I had ever seen, because I did not have a ton of experience with David Lynch films up until that point. And I remember, and this is, I don't know, close to 20 years ago is when I first watched it. At least 15 years ago is when I first watched Twin Peaks. But it was that scene where I just went, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen. And whatever this show does from this point forward, I'm on board. I will trust David Lynch to the end, because that is one of the, it is just such a brilliantly strange scene. And it's so wonderful. And then another one with the butler is at the beginning of season 2 episode 1. The first, I don't know, I haven't actually tried to measure it, but I would say it's got to be at least 10 minutes, maybe a little bit longer than that, of Dale and the butler. And again, I'm not trying to give away too much for people who have not seen the show, but Dale and the butler, who are having totally different experiences. They are living in two different realities at that point, right? It's hard to interpret it any other way. And this is really where it reinforces my theory that everything in the show is being hinged upon this concept of surrealism. That butler, he is living in some whole other place. He's having some whole other experience than Dale is having for those first 10 minutes. And that patience that David Lynch believes the audience must have, like, that is on full display in that moment, like for that long sequence where it's obvious that most shows you could imagine that people would just be screaming at the television, like, get some help, do something, what are you doing? And it just goes on and on and on and on. And I think that David Lynch kind of knows that we're squirming a little bit, but it's also so strange that it's delightful in a sense of the fact that there is such incongruity between these two different characters and what Dale wants compared to what this butler wants, or I just want the thumbs up. I just want the thumbs up until Dale finally provides it to him. It's so weird. It's so out there. And it's so great at the same time. So the last thing that I want to say with this is if you are a huge fan of Twin Peaks and you've got friends or family and you desperately want them to watch the show, but you don't know how to explain it. You don't know how to explain your affinity for it, your appreciation for the show, then hopefully I've done a good job in explaining that, in what it is that like how to even approach the show, because it is very different. And like I say, it is not trying to portray reality as we experience it. That is not the purpose of the show. And once you start understanding it is going to shift between genres, there's a purpose for this, which is the purpose, like the overall, the thing that's hanging over this entire show is this element of surrealism. And then beyond that, it's playing with this idea of, even if it's not reality, what can these characters do? Because they're locked into it. So even if it's all a dream, even though it's probably not all a dream, or whether it is or isn't, it doesn't change the fact that everything that happens within the show has real world implications. But imagine each character is experiencing a slightly different dream, right? So they're all having, some people are having a nightmare, some people are having a romantic dream, some people are having a comedic dream, some people are having the like any combination thereof, and they're all kind of locked into that in this whole big shared universe. That hopefully can help explain what is happening here within the show, and that is getting into pretty deep philosophical questions, like I say, with Cartesian epistemology, which is like Descartes' theory of how do we know, how do we trust what reality is. It's similar to the storyline that you get in The Matrix, except you never get that reveal. There's never that, hey, this is ultimately what reality is. It's just, you don't know. You don't know, and neither do the characters. So you just kind of go with it. But I think there's also this temptation, because it's such a strange show, and I think there's so many times when I'm watching it that I just it staggers me that there are as many people who love the show as there really are. That I watch it and I just think it's so weird, it's so out there, it's so strange and wonderful all at once, but this is not conventional storytelling, and it's not conventional television, and it does not appeal to the masses. I really don't see how it would appeal to the masses. And yet at the same time, even though it is a cult favorite, right, where you've got a small group of highly devoted fans, there is a fair bit of broad appeal, bigger than I would think. And I think there is the temptation, and at least I kind of experienced this, to kind of like hang on to it and say, no, it's my thing. It's my precious thing that I like, and I like the fact that other people don't really know it or don't really like it the way I like it. And I'm saying that I get that, but at the same time, maybe we should share our love a little bit more for it and try to do a better job of explaining it to people, and hopefully this helps, because I feel like the first time I tried to get somebody to watch this who he was a good friend of mine, and he considered himself to be somebody who enjoyed fairly artistic cinematic stories, like film versus a movie, right? And he just failed immediately. Like, we watched the pilot together. This was quite a while ago, and there's all these moments of melodrama, and he was just like, that was really bad acting. What was wrong with that? Why was there so much like that music was so over the top, like, and he was just like, it's bad. And I had not fully thought through what was going on in the show, because I kind of intuitively understood it, but I didn't have the vocabulary to explain it. And that might be your experience as well, that you just intuitively get this. You're like, yeah, it's not really supposed to be portraying reality like that. And yeah, everything's cranked up to 11. And it's overwhelming you with affect, with feeling, with intensity. And it's just screaming at you, pay attention. We're going to shift from this genre to this one, to this one, to this one, to this one, and back again. That you might not know how to explain that, or why you enjoy that, or what makes it great. But maybe we can all kind of try a little bit more to do that. And maybe this is just selfish of me, but it's like, because I want more Twin Peaks stuff. And if there continues to be a lot of popularity, maybe we'll get more Twin Peaks stuff. And even if we don't, it's perfectly fine, because we've got plenty to enjoy, which is where I'll wrap this up, because like I say, I have not watched Twin Peaks season 3, and it's just I'm a busy person. I do a lot of different things, so I've not had a chance to get to it until now, but I've got it ready to go. So that's going to be coming up on the podcast at some point fairly soon. And before I get into that, though, that I am going to try to treat this in the order that I think it should be treated in. And so I'm going to get caught up as best I can with the secret history of Twin Peaks, 25 years in between seasons 1 and 2 and Twin Peaks: The Return. So I'll be doing a discussion of this and a review for my BookTube channel, which again is the same YouTube channel, and then I'll do a discussion of season 3 of Twin Peaks: The Return, and then I'll do a separate video on the final dossier, which was published just after season 3. Okay, folks, this is my first time doing the podcast on my own as a lecture style podcast, and I would be very interested to know what you think of this. I am, and in case you did not know this already, so I am one of my jobs, because I do a bunch of different things in addition to being like an author. Then I'm also working as a college professor, and I've been a teacher for a very long time. So clearly, I have no issue speaking for a very, very long time uninterrupted and doing a proper lecture. Maybe you enjoyed this, maybe you didn't, but I didn't have somebody to bounce ideas off of. But if you can comment below over what you think of this format for the podcast, I would really appreciate it. And any comments or thoughts that you've got on it, then feel free to share those below. All right, folks, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.
Ignore the bell, people. We're gonna keep going. We're still ignoring it. Don't worry. I don't know what that. I think that's the fire drill. All right, we're gonna go home. Yeah. All right, we're done.